Some destinies are written in starlight before we take our first breath, carved into the fabric of fate by forces older than memory itself. Others are forged in the crucible of betrayal, shaped by choices made in desperation and sealed with the currency of broken trust. Isolde Ravenscar had always known she was expendable, a daughter in a world that valued sons, a quiet presence in a household that demanded bold voices, a gentle soul born into a bloodline built on conquest and cruelty. Her father, Lord Aldwyn Ravenscar, had raised her like livestock being prepared for market, well-fed, properly trained, and utterly without agency in determining her own fate. When the blood debt came due, when years of territorial disputes and broken treaties finally demanded payment that could not be made in gold or land, Isolde became the coin with which her father chose to purchase his survival. She was packaged in silk and ceremony, presented as a gesture of goodwill to the very enemies her family had spent generations fighting, sold under the pretty lie of diplomatic marriage. But she was not the only one trapped by forces beyond her control. 1,000 miles away, in a stronghold carved from black stone and ancient fury, Lycan King Valor Nightborn woke each dawn from dreams that had haunted him since childhood. Always the same vision, a woman with storm-gray eyes and moonlit skin, standing in shadows that seemed to bend around her like living things. She never spoke in these dreams, but her presence filled him with a longing so profound it felt like drowning, a recognition so complete it transcended the boundaries between sleeping and waking. His advisors called them prophetic visions, fragments of destiny bleeding through the veil between what was and what was meant to be. Vylor had built an empire on such prophecies, had conquered territories and crushed rebellions based on dreams that showed him paths to victory written in blood and starlight. But this dream, this woman who visited him in sleep and left him aching in wakefulness, remained a mystery that no amount of conquest or power could solve. Until the morning when fate decided that some chains cannot be broken by death or distance, and some bonds are strong enough to survive even the cruelest betrayal. Neither Isolde nor Valor knew that their stories had been intertwining since before they were born, that every choice and circumstance had been leading them toward a collision that would reshape not just their own lives, but the very balance of power that governed their world. This is the story of how destiny wears many faces, sometimes appearing as sacrifice, sometimes as salvation, always as a force too powerful to deny even when its price seems impossible to pay. It is the tale of a king who learned that true strength comes not from conquering others, but from surrendering to the one fate he had never dared claim, and a woman who discovered that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is accepting the love you were born to receive. Above all, it is the story of two hearts that found each other across the vast darkness of betrayal and emerged transformed, not by the dreams that had promised their union, but by the choice to make those dreams reality, despite every force arrayed against them. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The iron shackles around Isolde's wrists had rubbed her skin raw during the 7-day journey across the wasteland that separated Ravenscar territory from the domain of the Nightborn pack. Each jolt of the prisoner transport cart sent fresh waves of pain through her shoulders, but she had long since stopped attempting to find a comfortable position. Comfort was a luxury that had been stripped from her the moment her father signed the treaty that traded her freedom for his continued breathing. Through the barred window of the cart, Isolde watched the landscape transform from the familiar rolling hills of her homeland to something altogether more ominous. The trees here grew taller and darker, their branches interwoven so thickly that even midday felt like twilight. The very air seemed heavier, charged with an ancient power that made her wolf press low in submission, despite her human mind's attempts at defiance. "Almost there, girl," the guard captain called from his position at the front of the convoy, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who transported human cargo as routinely as others might deliver grain or livestock. "King Valor's stronghold lies just beyond those peaks. Hope you've made your peace with whatever gods you pray to, because where you're going, mercy isn't exactly in abundance." Isolde said nothing, having learned during the first day of travel that responses only invited more creative forms of torment from guards who seemed to view her fear as entertainment. Instead, she focused on the breathing exercises her mother had taught her before consumption claimed her life 5 years ago. Slow, steady inhales that helped keep the panic at bay, and the tears locked safely behind her eyes. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not today. Not when she was so close to whatever fate awaited her in the Nightborn stronghold. The convoy crested a ridge as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, and Isolde caught her first glimpse of her destination. The sight stole what little breath she had managed to gather. Shadowmere Fortress rose from the valley floor like a monument to controlled violence, its black stone walls reaching toward the darkening sky with predatory grace. Towers twisted upward in spirals that seemed to defy architectural logic, their surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Even at this distance, Isolde could feel the weight of ancient power radiating from the structure. Magic so old and deep it had seeped into the very stones. "Impressive, isn't it?" The guard captain laughed, noting her expression. "They say the fortress was built on a convergence of ley lines, that the Nightborn kings have been drawing power from the earth itself for over 1,000 years, makes them stronger than ordinary wolves, faster, more brutal. Your father must truly despise you to send you here." The casual cruelty of the observation hit harder than any physical blow could have. Because the guard was right. Her father had known exactly what kind of fate he was condemning her to when he signed the treaty. Lord Aldwyn Ravenscar was many things, but ignorant was not among them. He had researched his enemies thoroughly during decades of territorial disputes, had made it his business to understand every advantage the Nightborn pack possessed. Which meant he knew that Lycan King Valor Nightborn was rumored to be more beast than man, a ruler who had unified the northern territories through conquests so brutal that entire bloodlines had simply vanished rather than face his wrath. Stories told of enemies who had challenged him directly being found torn apart, in ways that suggested claws and teeth rather than blades. And into that monster's domain, her father had sent his only daughter like an offering to appease some ancient and terrible god. The gates of Shadowmere Fortress loomed before them as the convoy completed its descent, massive portals carved from what looked like a single piece of obsidian. They opened silently at the convoy's approach, revealing no visible mechanism or guards, just yawning darkness that seemed to swallow light, rather than merely blocking it. "Never seen gates like that before," one of the younger guards muttered, his earlier bravado noticeably absent as they passed through the entrance. "They don't make any sound. Don't see any chains or pulleys." "How do they—" "Magic," the captain interrupted sharply, "and not the kind you want to understand too clearly. Keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut until we complete this delivery." The courtyard beyond the gates was vast and eerily beautiful, paved with the same black stone as the walls, but inlaid with silver patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the torchlight. Guards in midnight blue uniforms moved through the space with the fluid grace of born predators, their attention turning toward the convoy with interest that felt distinctly threatening. But it was the figure waiting at the center of the courtyard who commanded Isolde's complete attention. Even from a distance, even in the uncertain light of dusk and flame, there was no mistaking who he was. Valor Nightborn stood with the absolute stillness of someone who had never doubted his own power, dressed in simple dark clothes that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less formal. He was taller than she had expected, built with the lean strength of a wolf in his prime, but it was his presence that truly marked him as different from ordinary men. Authority radiated from him in waves that made every other person in the courtyard seem diminished by comparison. This was not a man who ruled through inherited title or political maneuvering. This was a predator who had clawed his way to the top of the hierarchy and stayed there through sheer force of will. The convoy came to a stop before him, and Isolde felt her breath catch as those legendary golden eyes fixed on her through the bars of her prison. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other across the space that separated captive from captor, and Isolde felt something shift deep in her chest. Recognition of a kind she couldn't name, accompanied by a pull so strong it made her wolf whimper with confusion. This was impossible. She had never seen this man before in her life, had never even been in the same territory as him, but something about his presence felt achingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream, or a song heard in childhood, and never quite forgotten. "Release her," Baylor's voice carried clearly across the courtyard despite being barely above conversational volume. The guard captain immediately jumped to comply, producing keys with hands that shook slightly as he unlocked the cart's door and Isolde's shackles. "Careful with those restraints," Valor added, his tone carrying a warning that made the captain go pale. "Any unnecessary damage to our guest will be taken from your hide." Guest. Not prisoner, not hostage, not bargaining chip. Guest. Isolde filed away the distinction while rubbing feeling back into her freed wrists, uncertain whether the courtesy was genuine kindness or simply political theater designed to maintain the pretense of diplomatic marriage. She climbed down from the cart on unsteady legs, her body protesting after 7 days of confinement and poor treatment. But even exhausted and disheveled, Isolde forced herself to stand straight as she faced the Lycan king, who now held complete power over her fate. Up close, Valor Nightborn was even more overwhelming than distance had suggested. His dark hair showed threads of silver that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than mere age, and his golden eyes held depths that seemed to contain entire lifetimes of experience. There was cruelty written in the sharp planes of his face. Yes, but also something else. An intelligence that missed nothing, and a weariness that suggested ruling through strength came with prices that were rarely acknowledged. Lady Isolde Ravenscar, he said formally, inclining his head in a gesture that was precisely correct without being warm. Welcome to Shadowmere Fortress. I trust your journey was adequate. The pause before the final word suggested he was well aware of exactly how she had been treated during transport. Isolde found herself studying his expression, searching for clues about his intentions, and finding nothing but carefully controlled neutrality. Your Majesty, she replied, dropping into the curtsy that had been drilled into her since childhood. Thank you for your hospitality. Valor's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. Diplomacy. Your father trained you well. He gestured toward the fortress entrance, where more guards waited with torches that cast dancing shadows on the carved walls. Come, we have much to discuss. Isolde fell into step beside him, hyper-aware of the way his presence seemed to alter the very air around them. Other guards and servants they passed immediately dropped their gazes and stepped aside, creating clear paths without any visible command from their king. This was power so absolute it no longer needed to be demonstrated. It simply was. Tell me, Valor said as they entered the fortress proper. What exactly did your father tell you about the terms of this arrangement? The question caught Isolde off guard with its directness. She had expected threats or negotiations or perhaps ceremonial formalities, not what sounded almost like genuine curiosity about her understanding of her situation. He told me that I was being offered in marriage to secure peace between our territories, she answered carefully, that this alliance would prevent further bloodshed and ensure the prosperity of both our peoples. Offered, Valor repeated thoughtfully. An interesting choice of words. Did he also explain what happens to offerings that displease the gods they're meant to appease? The implication sent ice through Isolde's veins, but she forced her voice to remain steady. He seemed confident that I would find favor with the recipient. And are you? Confident, I mean. They had stopped walking without Isolde realizing it, and she found herself facing the Lycan king in a corridor lined with portraits of his predecessors, men and women whose painted eyes seemed to watch their conversation with predatory interest. I am confident that I will do my duty, whatever that may require, Isolde said, lifting her chin slightly in unconscious defiance. My personal comfort is not the primary concern. Something flickered in Valor's golden eyes at her words. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Your duty, he murmured. And what do you believe that duty entails, Lady Ravenscar? Heat flooded Isolde's cheeks as the implications of his question registered. Marriage to a Lycan king would certainly involve expectations that went far beyond diplomatic ceremony, and her father had made it clear that her compliance in all matters would be essential to maintaining the fragile peace. I am prepared to fulfill whatever obligations my position requires, she managed, hoping her voice carried more conviction than she felt. Valor studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. Then, to her complete shock, he stepped closer. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could catch his scent of pine and steel, and something wilder that made her pulse quicken despite her fear. And if I told you, he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, that I have been dreaming of you for 20 years, that I have seen your face in visions since I was a boy, that your voice has called to me across distances that should have made connection impossible. What would you make of that, Lady Ravenscar? Isolde's breath stopped entirely as his words registered. Dreams? Visions? She stared into those golden eyes and felt the world tilt around her as memories stirred, fragments of her own dreams, images of a dark-haired man with eyes like molten amber, a presence that had comforted her through the loneliest nights of her childhood. "That's impossible," she whispered. Valor's smile was sharp and entirely without humor. "Is it? Or is it simply easier to believe in political convenience than in forces that transcend the boundaries of what we think we understand?" Before Isolde could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor. Valor immediately stepped back, his expression shifting to the neutral authority of a king conducting official business. "Your Majesty," a woman's voice called, and Isolde turned to see an elegant figure approaching with confident strides. She was beautiful in the way of wolves who had never known defeat, with silver-streaked auburn hair and green eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. Her midnight blue gown was cut in the style favored by high-ranking nobles, and she wore her authority like a crown. "Lady Morgana," Valor acknowledged with a slight nod. "Allow me to present Lady Isolde Ravenscar. Lady Ravenscar, this is Lady Morgana Shadowvale, my chief advisor and the keeper of Shadowmere's domestic arrangements." Morgana's gaze swept over Isolde with calculating precision, taking in every detail from her travel-stained dress to her defensive posture. "So this is Aldwyn Ravenscar's peace offering," she said, her tone suggesting she found the concept distinctly underwhelming. "She's smaller than I expected." "Size is not always indicative of strength," Valor replied mildly, but Isolde caught the warning undertone in his voice. "I trust you've prepared appropriate quarters for our guest?" "Of course, Your Majesty. The solar suite has been readied, with guards posted for her protection." Morgana's smile was perfectly courteous and completely cold. "I've also arranged for a seamstress to attend her tomorrow. Her current wardrobe is insufficient for court appearances." Isolde felt heat flood her cheeks at the obvious criticism of her appearance, but before she could respond, Valor's voice cut through the tension. "Lady Ravenscar has endured 7 days of travel under less than ideal conditions," he said quietly, but something in his tone made Morgana's expression shift to wariness. "I expect she will be treated with the respect due to any honored guest in my household. Any discourtesy shown to her will be considered a personal insult to me." The warning was unmistakable, and Morgana's reaction made it clear that insulting the Lycan king was not an error anyone made twice in Shadowmere Fortress. "Of course, Your Majesty," Morgana said smoothly. "Lady Ravenscar will receive every consideration appropriate to her station." Valor nodded once, then turned back to Isolde. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow we begin negotiations regarding the terms of our arrangement. I suspect there are things about your situation that neither of us fully understands yet." As Morgana led her away toward the solar suite, Isolde found herself looking back over her shoulder at the man who held her fate in his hands. Valor remained standing in the corridor, his golden eyes following her progress, with an intensity that made her skin warm despite her exhaustion. 20 years of dreams, visions of her face calling to him across impossible distances. Either the Lycan king was playing some elaborate psychological game designed to make her more compliant, or fate had woven their stories together long before her father's treaty had forced their paths to cross. As she was shown to quarters that were more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced, as servants brought hot food and prepared a bath that would wash away the grime of travel, Isolde found herself returning again and again to the moment when Valor's eyes had met hers across the courtyard. The recognition she had felt, that sense of impossible familiarity, it hadn't been one-sided. She had seen her own confusion and wonder reflected in his golden gaze, had felt the same inexplicable pull that had made her want to step toward him rather than away. If he was telling the truth about the dreams, then her arrival at Shadowmere Fortress was not the beginning of their story, but simply the next chapter in something that had been written long before either of them was born. And that possibility was more terrifying than any threat or political manipulation could ever be. Isolde woke before dawn from dreams that left her heart racing and her skin flushed with heat she couldn't explain. Fragments of images lingered in her mind, golden eyes watching her from shadows, strong hands reaching for her across vast distances, and always that voice, deep and familiar, calling her name with a desperation that transcended the boundaries between sleeping and waking. She had dreamed of him before. The realization settled over her like cold water as she sat up in the magnificent bed that dominated her solar suite, her hands shaking as memory after buried memory surfaced from the depths of her subconscious. The dark-haired man with amber eyes who had visited her sleep throughout childhood, who had comforted her through her mother's illness and death, who had whispered promises of protection during the darkest nights of her adolescence. She had convinced herself those dreams were products of imagination, desperate fantasies created by a lonely girl who craved the kind of unconditional love her father had never provided. But now, having looked into Valor Nightborn's eyes and felt that shock of recognition, Isolde could no longer dismiss what she had been experiencing for nearly 2 decades. The Lycan king had been telling the truth. They had been dreaming of each other long before politics and blood debts had forced their paths to cross. A soft knock at her chamber door interrupted her spiraling thoughts, followed by a woman's voice calling politely for permission to enter. Isolde quickly pulled a robe over her nightgown and opened the door to find a young maid with kind eyes and gentle hands, carrying a tray of breakfast that smelled better than anything Isolde had eaten in the past week. "Good morning, my lady," the maid said with a curtsy that seemed genuinely respectful rather than perfunctory. "I'm Sarah, assigned to attend you during your stay. His Majesty requested that you be served breakfast in your chambers this morning, but you're expected in the Great Hall at midday for discussions regarding your situation." Sarah's careful pause before the final word suggested that everyone in Shadowmere Fortress was aware of the unusual circumstances surrounding Isolde's arrival, though none seemed entirely certain how to categorize her presence. Was she prisoner or guest, political hostage or honored bride-to-be? The ambiguity itself was probably intentional, designed to keep potential opponents off balance while Valor determined how to proceed. "Thank you, Sarah," Isolde said, accepting the tray gratefully. Fresh fruit, warm bread, and what appeared to be real honey, luxuries that had been rare even in her father's household during the past few years of territorial disputes and resource scarcity. "Is there anything I should know about court protocol here? Expectations or customs I should observe?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful as she helped Isolde arrange the breakfast items on a small table near the window that offered spectacular views of the mountains surrounding Shadowmere Fortress. "The Nightborn court is less formal than some," Sarah said carefully, "but His Majesty values directness over diplomacy. Flattery and political maneuvering tend to irritate him rather than impress him. He appreciates honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." She paused, glancing toward the door as if worried about being overheard. "And, my lady, Lady Morgana has significant influence here. It would be wise to avoid giving her reasons to view you as a threat." The warning was diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably genuine. Isolde nodded her understanding, filing away the information while wondering exactly what kind of threat a powerless hostage could possibly represent to an established court advisor. "Sarah," Isolde said carefully, "has His Majesty ever mentioned having dreams or visions, prophecies about future events?" The young maid's eyes widened slightly, and Isolde immediately regretted the question. But before she could retract it, Sarah leaned closer and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "The Nightborn kings have always been touched by sight beyond the veil," she murmured. "His Majesty's grandfather built this fortress because of visions that showed him exactly where the ley lines converged. His father predicted the Great Drought 15 years before it happened and prepared the territory accordingly. And His Majesty himself," she trailed off, glancing around nervously. "What about His Majesty?" Isolde prompted gently. "They say he's been having the same dream since childhood," Sarah whispered. "A woman calling to him from across vast distances, showing him glimpses of a future that seemed impossible until recently. The court seers believe it was prophecy, meant to guide him toward his destined mate." Isolde's breath caught as the implications settled into place. If Valor's dreams had been prophetic rather than mere fantasy, if fate had indeed been guiding them toward each other across decades and territorial boundaries, then her presence here represented something far more significant than political convenience, or her father's desperate attempt to settle a blood debt. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Sarah nodded, before quickly gathering the empty tray and departing, clearly anxious to avoid being caught discussing royal prophecies with the mysterious guest. Alone again, Isolde moved to the window and gazed out at the landscape that would likely become her permanent home. The mountains rose around the fortress like protective walls, their peaks shrouded in mist that caught and reflected the morning light. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that spoke of power older than human civilization, of forces that operated according to laws more ancient than politics or warfare. She was still standing there when another knock came at her door, this one more confident and authoritative. When she opened it, she found a woman perhaps 10 years older than herself, dressed in the deep purple that marked her as holding high rank within the court hierarchy. "Lady Ravenscar," the woman said with a smile that didn't reach her calculating blue eyes. "I am Lady Cordelia Thornwick, keeper of court protocol and traditions. His Majesty has asked me to assist you in preparing for this afternoon's discussions." Isolde inclined her head politely, though something about Cordelia's manner set her immediately on edge. "That's very kind. What sort of preparation did His Majesty have in mind?" "Oh, primarily matters of appearance and presentation," Cordelia replied, stepping into the chamber without invitation, and examining Isolde with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding flaws. "Your current attire is entirely inappropriate for formal court proceedings, of course. We'll need to address that immediately." Before Isolde could respond, Cordelia was opening the large wardrobe that dominated one wall of the chamber, revealing an array of gowns in rich fabrics and jewel tones that hadn't been there the night before. "Where did these come from?" Isolde asked, fingering the silk sleeve of a dress that probably cost more than her father's annual income. "His Majesty ordered them prepared overnight," Cordelia said dismissively. "The seamstresses worked through the night to ensure you would have appropriate options. We cannot have you appearing before the court looking like a refugee, after all." The casual cruelty of the observation stung, but Isolde forced herself to remain composed. She was beginning to understand that navigating Shadowmere's court would require skills her relatively sheltered upbringing had never demanded: the ability to smile while being insulted, to appear grateful for help that came wrapped in condescension, to find allies among people who viewed her as either threat or opportunity. This one, I think. Cordelia selected a dress in deep emerald that would complement Isolde's coloring while making a statement about wealth and status. It will need minor adjustments, but nothing that cannot be accomplished before midday. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of activity, as Cordelia transformed Isolde's appearance with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing court presentations. The emerald gown was indeed beautiful, cut to emphasize Isolde's natural grace, while the rich color brought out the storm gray of her eyes. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of noble breeding, and subtle cosmetics enhanced her features without appearing artificial. When Cordelia finally stepped back to survey her work, Isolde barely recognized the woman reflected in the full-length mirror. Gone was the travel-stained refugee who had arrived in chains. In her place stood someone who could credibly claim noble birth, who looked capable of standing beside a king without appearing diminished by the comparison. "Better," Cordelia pronounced with satisfaction. "You look almost worthy of His Majesty's attention now. Remember to keep your posture straight, your voice clear, and your responses brief, unless asked to elaborate. The court will be watching for any sign of weakness or unsuitability." "Unsuitability for what, exactly?" Isolde asked, adjusting the unfamiliar weight of the elaborate gown. Cordelia's smile was sharp and knowing. "That, my dear, depends entirely on His Majesty's intentions, which, I suspect, are about to become much clearer." The great hall of Shadowmere Fortress was even more impressive than Isolde had expected, with soaring ceilings supported by columns carved from single pieces of black marble, and windows that cast jeweled patterns of light across the polished floor. At the far end, beneath banners displaying the silver wolf of House Nightborne, sat a throne that seemed to have been carved from the living mountain itself, ancient, imposing, and radiating power that made Isolde's wolf press low in instinctive submission. Vylor occupied that throne with the casual authority of someone born to command, dressed in formal court attire that emphasized both his physical presence and his royal status, but it was his expression that captured Isolde's complete attention as she was announced, and began the long walk across the hall toward the dais. He was watching her approach with an intensity that seemed to strip away every careful defense she had constructed, golden eyes tracking her movement with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. But underneath the royal authority and controlled power, Isolde could see something else. Recognition, wonder, and what might have been relief so profound it bordered on pain. The court had assembled to witness this meeting, filling the hall with representatives of every major house and faction within Vylor's territory. Isolde could feel their gazes following her progress, cataloging every detail of her appearance and demeanor for future analysis and gossip. Among them, she spotted Lady Morgana standing near the throne with an expression of barely concealed displeasure, clearly unhappy about whatever direction this encounter might take. When Isolde reached the appropriate distance from the throne, she sank into the deep curtsy that court protocol demanded, her emerald skirts pooling around her like spilled water. She held the position for the prescribed count, before rising gracefully, her eyes lowered in the traditional gesture of respect. "Lady Isolde Ravenscar." Valor's voice carried clearly through the hall, pitched for every ear while somehow seeming intimate and personal. "You appear transformed this morning." "Your Majesty's hospitality has been most generous," Isolde replied, the formal words feeling strange on her tongue after their more personal conversation the previous evening. "Indeed." Valor leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me, Lady Ravenscar, how do you find Shadowmere Fortress? Does it meet your expectations?" The question seemed innocuous enough, but Isolde could sense deeper currents moving beneath the surface of court politeness. Everything about this exchange was being carefully observed and analyzed by the assembled nobles, their interpretations of her responses potentially shaping her future treatment within the pack hierarchy. "The fortress is magnificent, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "Far grander than anything in my father's territory. I am honored to be a guest within its walls." "Guest," Valor repeated thoughtfully, and Isolde caught the slight emphasis he placed on the word. An interesting choice of terminology. "Tell me, what do you understand about the circumstances that brought you here?" Heat flooded Isolde's cheeks as she realized this was not going to be a private negotiation, but a public examination of her situation, conducted before an audience that would dissect every word and gesture. She glanced quickly at the assembled court, noting expressions that ranged from curious to calculating to openly hostile. "I understand that my father entered into a treaty with Your Majesty," she said, choosing her words with extreme care. "An agreement designed to secure peace between our territories and prevent further bloodshed. And your role in this treaty?" "I was offered as surety for my father's good faith, Your Majesty, a gesture of trust and commitment to the alliance." Murmurs rippled through the assembled court at her diplomatic phrasing. Several nobles exchanged meaningful glances, clearly recognizing the careful way she had described what was essentially her sale to a hostile power. Valor's expression remained neutral, but Isolde caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested displeasure with something. Whether her response or the situation itself, she couldn't determine. "Offered," he said quietly. "Tell me, Lady Ravenscar, were you consulted about this offer? Did you have any voice in the negotiations that determined your fate?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. This was not the sort of inquiry typically made in formal court settings, where diplomatic fiction was carefully maintained regardless of underlying reality. But Valor seemed determined to strip away pretense and examine the truth beneath. "My consultation was not deemed necessary, Your Majesty," she admitted quietly. "My father believed he was acting in the best interests of our people." "I see." Valor rose from his throne with fluid grace, descending the steps of the dais until he stood directly before her. This close, Isolde could see the threads of silver in his dark hair, could catch his scent of pine and steel, and something wilder that made her pulse quicken, despite the formal setting. "And what do you believe, Lady Ravenscar? Do you think your father acted in your best interests when he signed that treaty?" The question was dangerous on multiple levels. Answer honestly, and she would be criticizing not only her father, but the very agreement that had brought her here, potentially insulting her host and undermining the fragile peace. Lie, and she would be denying her own experience while appearing to approve of being traded like property. But as Isolde looked into Valor's golden eyes, she found herself remembering his words about valuing honesty over diplomacy. And perhaps, after years of being voiceless and powerless, it was time to claim some small measure of truth. "I believe my father acted according to his understanding of necessity, Your Majesty," she said carefully. "But I also believe that necessity and justice do not always align perfectly." The hall fell into complete silence as the implications of her words settled over the assembled court. She had just acknowledged that the treaty might be legal and politically expedient while simultaneously suggesting it was morally questionable, a distinction that could have far-reaching consequences depending on how it was interpreted. Valor studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her complete shock, the corner of his mouth curved in what might have been approval. "Wisdom," he said quietly. "The ability to distinguish between what is legal and what is right, a quality often lacking in political arrangements." He turned to address the assembled court, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "Which brings us to the question of how to proceed with an arrangement that may be legally binding but ethically questionable." Lady Morgana stepped forward from her position near the throne, her expression carefully controlled, but her displeasure evident to anyone who knew how to read court dynamics. "Your Majesty," she said formally, "surely the legality of the treaty is the primary concern. Lord Ravenscar's debts are significant, and the territorial concessions agreed upon were substantial. To question the arrangement now could destabilize the entire agreement. Could it?" Vailor's tone remained conversational, but something in his posture shifted that made several courtiers take unconscious steps backward. "And what would you suggest as the alternative, Lady Morgana? That we honor an agreement that treats a noble daughter as chattel to be traded for political convenience?" "I would suggest that we honor commitments made in good faith," Morgana replied carefully. "Regardless of any personal complications that may have arisen since the agreement was signed." Personal complications. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge, and Isolde realized that whatever had passed between her and Vailor the previous evening had not gone unnoticed by his chief advisor. Morgana was warning him that his interest in Isolde was being observed and analyzed, that any deviation from political necessity would be seen as weakness or emotional compromise. Vailor's smile was sharp and entirely without warmth as he turned his golden gaze on Morgana. "Personal complications," he repeated thoughtfully. "An interesting way to describe the fulfillment of prophecy that has guided this pack for 2 decades. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled court. Prophecy was not something discussed lightly in territories where the rulers were known to be touched by supernatural sight, and the implication that Isolde's arrival represented some form of divine destiny sent shockwaves through the careful political calculations that governed court behavior. "Your Majesty," Morgana said, her composure finally cracking slightly, "surely you don't mean to suggest that this arrangement is anything more than political necessity?" "I mean to suggest," Vailor interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "that there are forces at work here that transcend the petty territorial disputes and blood debts that motivate ordinary politics, and I will not see them reduced to matters of convenience or expedience." He turned back to Isolde, extending his hand in a gesture that was both invitation and command. "Lady Ravenscar, will you walk with me? There are private matters we must discuss before any final decisions can be made." Isolde hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin through her gloves and the immediate sense of rightness that accompanied the contact. As Vailor led her from the hall through a side entrance, leaving behind a court buzzing with speculation and barely controlled excitement, she caught one last glimpse of Morgana's expression, fury mixed with calculation, and what might have been fear. Whatever was happening between her and the Lycan king, it was clearly threatening carefully established power structures within Shadowmere Fortress. And that meant the real negotiations were only beginning. The private solar where Vailor brought her was smaller and more intimate than the Great Hall, with comfortable seating arranged around a fireplace that cast warm light across tapestries, depicting the history of the Nightborn pack. Windows offered views of the mountains that seemed less imposing from this vantage point, more protective than threatening. "Finally," Vailor said as the doors closed behind them, his formal court manner immediately dropping away to reveal something more genuine and infinitely more compelling, "I was beginning to think we would never have another moment without an audience of dozens analyzing our every word." Isolde settled into the chair he indicated, acutely aware of how the formal gown she wore marked her as playing a role rather than simply being herself. "Your court seems very attentive to your personal affairs, Your Majesty." My court," Vailor said dryly, moving to pour wine from a crystal decanter, "seems to forget that I managed to conquer half the northern territories before I turned 30, which suggests I might be capable of making decisions without their constant supervision." He offered her a glass before settling into the chair across from hers. "And please, when we're alone, my name is Vailor. I think we've moved past the need for constant formal address." The casual intimacy of the request sent warmth through Isolde's chest, but it also heightened her awareness of how precarious her position remained. "I'm not certain that's wise. Vailor, your advisor seemed quite concerned about personal complications affecting your judgment." "Morgana," Vailor's expression darkened slightly, "is an excellent strategic mind and a capable administrator. She also has very definite ideas about how kings should behave, most of which involve suppressing any impulses that might be considered remotely human." He took a sip of his wine, studying Isolde over the rim of his glass. "Tell me, what did you make of yesterday's formal presentation? How did it feel to be examined like a prize mare at market?" The blunt question caught Isolde off guard, but his obvious displeasure with the circumstances encouraged her to answer honestly. Humiliating, she admitted quietly, but also illuminating. Your court is watching for any sign that I might influence you beyond what they consider appropriate. They see me as either threat or weakness, depending on how they interpret your interest. And how do you interpret my interest? Isolde set down her wineglass and looked directly into his golden eyes, feeling the same shock of recognition that had struck her in the courtyard the previous evening. Yesterday, you told me you had been dreaming of me for 20 years. Either that was an elaborate deception designed to make me more compliant, or there are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. Valor was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that seemed almost painful to reveal. When I was 8 years old, he said slowly, I began having dreams of a woman with storm-gray eyes and moonlit skin. She never spoke in those dreams, but her presence filled me with a longing so profound it felt like drowning. For 20 years I have seen her face in visions that have guided every major decision I've made as king. He leaned forward, his golden eyes intense. I built this fortress where the dreams showed me it should stand. I conquered territories because the visions revealed where my enemies would be vulnerable. I have shaped my entire life around prophecies that seemed to promise a future I couldn't imagine until yesterday, when you stepped out of that prisoner cart and became real. Isolde's breath caught as the weight of his confession settled over her. I've dreamed of you too, she whispered. A dark-haired man with amber eyes who comforted me through my mother's death, who promised protection during the darkest nights of my childhood. I convinced myself it was imagination, loneliness creating fantasy. But the moment I saw you, you recognized me, Valor finished quietly, just as I recognized you. They sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of their shared experience creating a connection that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Whatever was happening between them went far beyond political arrangement or physical attraction. It was recognition of something that had been building toward this moment for decades. So, what do we do now? Isolde asked finally. Your court expects you to make political decisions based on territorial advantage and resource management. But if our meeting was prophetic destiny rather than diplomatic convenience, then we face a choice, Valor said firmly. We can deny what we both know to be true, and attempt to proceed according to political necessity, or we can acknowledge that some bonds transcend the boundaries of what others consider reasonable and build something new. And the consequences? Your advisor made it clear that honoring prophecy over politics could destabilize your rule. Valor's smile was sharp and predatory. Let me worry about maintaining my throne, Isolde. I've been managing rebellious nobles and territorial disputes since I was 25. A few disgruntled courtiers aren't going to threaten the stability of my kingdom. He rose from his chair and extended his hand to her, his expression serious but hopeful. The question is whether you're willing to trust in something that defies rational explanation. Whether you can accept that your father's betrayal might have been the mechanism fate used to bring you exactly where you belonged. Isolde looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, seeing past the royal authority to the man who had been as surprised by their connection as she was. The choice he was offering would change everything, not just her own fate, but potentially the balance of power across the northern territories. But as she placed her hand in his and felt that immediate sense of rightness, of coming home to something she hadn't known she was missing, Isolde realized that some choices were made not by logic, but by recognition of truth, too deep to deny. I trust you, she said quietly, and I trust this, whatever it is. Valor's smile transformed his entire face, making him appear younger and infinitely more approachable. Then we begin writing a new kind of story, he said, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. One where destiny and choice work together instead of in opposition. As if summoned by their declaration, urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the solar, followed by a sharp knock at the door. "Enter!" Valor called, though his expression suggested he was not pleased by the interruption. A guard captain rushed in, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. "Your Majesty, urgent news from the border. Lord Ravenscar has mobilized his forces and is claiming that his daughter was kidnapped rather than delivered according to treaty. He's calling for support from neighboring packs to mount a rescue operation." The words hit Isolde like physical blows. Her father was not content to simply abandon her to her fate. He was actively working to destabilize the situation, potentially starting a war while claiming to act in her best interests. How large a force? Valor asked, his voice immediately shifting to the cold authority of a military commander. 300 mounted warriors, Your Majesty, with more being recruited from allied houses. They've made camp at Thornhill Pass, 2 days' march from our borders. Valor cursed softly, his hand tightening on Isolde's fingers. He's betting that I won't risk open warfare to keep one hostage, that I'll return you, rather than face a coalition of enemy forces. And will you? Isolde asked quietly, though she dreaded the answer. Valor turned to look at her, his golden eyes blazing with determination, and something deeper that made her heart race. I will do whatever is necessary to protect what belongs to me, he said firmly. And you, Isolde Ravenscar, belong here. Your father made that choice when he signed his treaty, and I'll be damned if I let him unmake it now for political convenience. He turned back to the guard captain, already moving into strategic planning mode. Send word to our border commanders. Full mobilization, but defensive positions only unless they cross into our territory. And send a message under royal seal to Lord Ravenscar. His daughter is safe and honored in my household, and any attempt to retrieve her by force will be considered an act of war. As the guard departed to carry out his orders, Isolde felt the weight of everything that was changing settle around her like a mantle she hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. Her father's betrayal had become the catalyst for something far larger than either of them had anticipated, and the consequences would ripple through the northern territories for years to come. But as Valor's arms came around her in a gesture of protection and promise, Isolde realized that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost seemed impossible to bear, especially then. The War Council convened before dawn in Shadowmere's ancient strategy chamber, where maps covered every surface and the air thrummed with barely controlled tension. Isolde stood beside Valor as he studied reports from border scouts, her presence at such a meeting raising eyebrows among the assembled commanders, but going unchallenged by royal decree. Ravenscar's forces have doubled overnight, Lord Commander Marcus reported grimly. He's calling in favors from every minor house that ever had disputes with us. Current count stands at 600 warriors, with siege equipment being transported from Ironhold. Valor's expression remained calm, but Isolde could feel the controlled fury radiating from him in waves. He's committed now, he said quietly. This isn't posturing. He means to break our treaty through force and reclaim what he considers his property. Your Majesty, Lady Morgana interjected from her position across the table. Perhaps we should consider the political ramifications. If we return Lady Ravenscar voluntarily, claim the treaty was fulfilled but she was homesick. No. Valor's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. I will not reward betrayal with compromise, and I will not send Isolde back to a man who sold her like livestock, then claimed her kidnapping when it served his purposes. Isolde felt warmth bloom in her chest at his fierce protectiveness, but she also recognized the impossible position her presence had created. Valor, she said quietly, if my being here means war, your being here means you're finally where you belong, he interrupted, turning to face her with golden eyes that blazed with determination. Your father made his choice when he signed that treaty. The consequences are his to bear, not yours. Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside the chamber. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and then the doors burst open to admit a travel-stained messenger, whose uniform marked him as one of Ravenscar's riders. I bear a message for the Lycan King, the man announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent chamber. From Lord Aldwin Ravenscar, rightful father and protector of Lady Isolde Ravenscar. Speak, Valor commanded, though his tone suggested the messenger would not enjoy the experience. The man unrolled an official proclamation, clearing his throat before reading. Lord Ravenscar formally accuses Valor Nightborn of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of his daughter in violation of all diplomatic protocols. He demands her immediate return and offers single combat to settle the matter according to ancient law, victory to determine the rightful custody of Lady Ravenscar. Gasps rippled through the assembled commanders. Single combat was rarely invoked in modern times, but it remained legally binding under the old codes that governed interpact disputes. If Valor accepted, he would stake everything on a single fight, his throne, his territory, and Isolde's fate. And if I refuse, Valor asked mildly, then Lord Ravenscar will consider all treaties void and proceed with military action to reclaim his daughter, with the support of allied houses who recognize his rightful authority. The chamber fell silent as everyone processed the ultimatum. Valor could fight a war against superior numbers with uncertain outcome, or risk everything in single combat against a man who had nothing left to lose. "Tell Lord Ravenscar," Valor said finally, his voice carrying absolute authority, "that I accept his challenge. Single combat at the Thornfield Basin, neutral ground between our territories. Tomorrow, at midday." The messenger nodded and departed quickly, leaving behind a council chamber buzzing with shocked discussions. Single combat between pack leaders was deadly serious. The loser typically didn't survive, and the winner claimed everything the defeated had staked. "Your Majesty," Morgana said urgently, "this is madness. You're risking your entire kingdom for one woman, no matter how significant she might be. Am I," Valor turned to address the full council, "or am I defending the principle that treaties cannot be broken through false accusations and military intimidation? If I allow Ravenscar to void our agreement through force, what message does that send to every other lord who might decide his word isn't binding?" It was a masterful reframing that transformed a personal choice into a matter of royal authority and legal precedent. But Isolde could see the fear in his advisor's eyes, the recognition that their king was risking everything for reasons they couldn't fully understand. "Valor," she said quietly, "may I speak with you privately?" He nodded and led her to an alcove where they could talk without being overheard by the anxious council members. "This is my fault," Isolde said immediately. "If I hadn't come here, if you hadn't protected me, if you hadn't come here," Valor interrupted gently, "I would have spent the rest of my life wondering why my dreams showed me a future I could never reach. You didn't create this situation, Isolde. Your father's greed and cowardice created it. But you're risking everything for me. Your throne, your life. I'm claiming what was always meant to be mine," he said firmly, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. 20 years of dreams, 20 years of visions guiding me toward this moment. Do you think I would abandon destiny now because it comes with a price?" Isolde looked into his golden eyes and saw not just determination, but absolute certainty, the unshakable faith of a man who had built an empire by trusting in prophecy that defied rational explanation. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Valor's smile was radiant. "I love you too, which is why I'm going to end this tomorrow and ensure no one can ever threaten what we have again." The night before the combat passed in a blur of preparations and prayers. Isolde barely slept, torn between watching Valor make his final arrangements and trying to process the magnitude of everything that had changed in just 3 days. When dawn broke gray and cold, she stood with him at the window of his chambers, memorizing every detail of his face while trying not to think about the possibility that this might be their last morning together. "If something happens," she began, but he silenced her with a kiss that tasted of promises and determination. "Nothing will happen," he said against her lips. "I've been preparing for this fight my entire life, even if I didn't know it until now." The journey to Thornfield Basin took 2 hours, with Shadowmere's forces providing escort while maintaining the neutrality required by combat law. Isolde rode beside Valor, her presence both the cause of the conflict and the prize that would be decided by its outcome. The basin itself was a natural amphitheater carved from living rock, with ancient stone circles that had witnessed single combats for over 1,000 years. Both armies had assembled on opposite sides of the field, creating a human arena around the sacred ground where the fight would take place. Lord Aldwin Ravenscar waited in the circle's center, and Isolde's breath caught as she saw her father for the first time in months. He looked older, diminished by desperation but still dangerous in the way of wolves who had nothing left to lose. "Daughter," he called as she approached with Valor's party, "I've come to take you home." "I'm home," Isolde replied quietly, the words carrying clearly across the silent basin. Something flickered in her father's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition that he had lost her in more ways than one. But when he spoke again, his voice held only grim determination. "Then we settle this according to the old laws. Valor Nightborn." He raised his voice to address the Lycan king directly. "Do you accept the terms of single combat for custody of my daughter?" "I do," Valor replied, stepping forward into the circle. "Though I would clarify, this combat determines not custody, but the right to protection. Your daughter will choose her own fate when this is finished." They faced each other in the center of the ancient ring, 2 alpha wolves representing different philosophies of power and honor. Aldwin was older, more experienced, with the cunning that came from decades of territorial warfare. But Valor was in his prime, strengthened by prophecy, and fighting not just for victory, but for the future he had seen in dreams. "Begin," the neutral arbiter called, and both men shifted instantly into their wolf forms. The battle was brutal and swift. Aldwin fought with the desperation of a man who had staked everything on this moment, using every trick and advantage his years of experience provided. But Valor fought with the focused intensity of destiny fulfilled, each movement guided by certainty that this was how their story was meant to end. When it was over, Aldwin lay motionless in the ancient circle, while Valor stood victorious, bloodied, but unbowed. According to the old laws, Isolde's fate was now his to determine, though both of them knew the choice had been made long before any combat was fought. "The matter is settled," Valor announced to the assembled armies, his voice carrying clearly across the basin. "Lady Isolde Ravenscar is free to choose her own path, under the protection of Shadowmere Fortress and the guarantee of safe passage should she wish to leave." He turned to face her, golden eyes holding a question that transcended law or custom. "I choose you," Isolde said clearly, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I choose this. I choose us." The armies began to disperse, the crisis resolved through victory that left no room for further challenge. But as Valor took Isolde in his arms, both of them knew the real triumph wasn't in the combat, but in the recognition that some bonds are stronger than politics, some love more powerful than fear. "So what happens now?" Isolde asked as they watched Shadowmere's forces prepare for the journey home. "Now," Valor said, his arms tightening around her, "we write the rest of our story, together, as it was always meant to be." And under the ancient sky that had witnessed their destiny unfold, Isolde finally understood that sometimes the cruelest betrayals become the pathways to our greatest joy, that her father's attempt to trade her away had delivered her exactly where she belonged, into the arms of the king who had been dreaming of her for 20 years. The dreams had been real, the prophecy had been true, and their love would reshape the Northern Territories for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.